Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started now. All right. So welcome to the session on just transition. My name is Delia Warren. I'm going to be moderating this session. We've had a few last minute changes. Unfortunately, Angela Carter, our session co-chair, was unable to attend. Her little boy was sick, so she had to deal with that, which happens. And Andrew Dibling from Holland College. You're not in the room by any chance, are you? No? Andrew Dibling will not be joining us today, as we do not know where he is. But that's okay. We've got a fantastic panel lined up. We're going to have some really great discussions. So I'm going to start just to give you a little bit of a run through of how this session is going to go. I'm going to give a very brief introduction. Following that, I'm going to ask Kerry Murray from the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor to give an introduction of himself and a brief presentation. We've got Seth Klein joining us bright and early in the morning from British Columbia. So thank you very much for getting out of bed. We wish we could share our coffee with you. He's the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's going to speak following Kerry. And after that, we're going to get into a Q&A where we can have a group discussion about a lot of the issues surrounding the just transition, and you get the chance to ask your panelists, including myself. I'm going to jump in as a panelist at that point, and we'll have a great conversation. Then we're going to break into the Citizens Assembly component. So you all see the notepads and the sticky dots on your table. We'll be having a conversation in our smaller groups about that, and then at the end we'll come back. Before we start that component, I'll go over everything again. I know that was a lot of information to take in about SMART goals and expectations of the discussions and that kind of thing. So we'll go through all that again, and then we'll get into that portion of the session. So thank you all for coming. This is obviously a very important part of the conversation that needs to happen around climate change. So we're all here to discuss the movement, you could call it, of just transition. So as I mentioned this morning, just transition encompasses all the social interventions that are needed to secure workers' livelihoods as economies shift in the effort to avoid climate change. From Catherine's presentation this morning, we saw as Canadians, we are actually responsible in a large degree for a lot of the emissions per capita that are present and causing the climate change catastrophe that's unraveling right now. And so we also have a great responsibility, and we want to make sure that we make the right decisions in moving away from our dependence on fossil fuels and high-emitting technologies. And that includes considering what's best for everyone, considering unintended consequences of actions, making sure that people that were integrated in the fossil fuel industry, in carbon-intensive industries, that their needs are met as we transition into a cleaner, lower emission future. And so that really means having discussions involving people like we're doing here today and coming up with solutions together, because this is going to require a lot of effort. It's you saw the graph that Brett posted. That's a black diamond ski slope of emissions reduction that's required. And so we need the support of society overall, and you will not have that support unless people themselves feel supported. So I mentioned that I am involved with an organization called Iron and Earth East. Just Transition is really at the core of what we do. The main goal of the organization, which was actually started in Alberta, was to empower oil and gas workers to build a renewable energy economy. But like we said, renewable energy is only one part of the solution to mitigating climate change. So I'll just give a few examples of how we've done that locally in Newfoundland and Labrador. Oops. So one thing we did is we started a social solar skills program. So we wanted people to be more aware of what can be done with renewable energy technology and to use that to build positive outcomes. So we've trained 30 people in Newfoundland and Labrador, right across the island in Labrador, to install rooftop solar under net metering, which is fairly new legislation in our province. And so you can see here from this picture, that's the roof of the Autism Society building. We've been working with them on the 365 Greenhouse Project. So this is a showcase of renewable energy technology that we conceptualize as a way to prove what's possible with the ingenuity behind these technologies. So this is a year-round permanent facility that can grow vegetables, addressing food sustainability issues within our province, year-round, completely powered by solar. So it's a net zero building. All of the energy it uses is generated on site over the course of the year. And so this is nearing construction. You can go have a look at it while you're in town at the Autism Society. And this is in support of two social enterprises that allow them to expand their operations. The Good Roots Gardening Program, which gives people on the autistic spectrum job skills to use in real life. And then the Pantry and Catering, where they use the vegetables they grow to sell in their on-site cafe and restaurant, which again generates revenues for their operations. I'll just finish by touching on a document that Iron and Earth created, where we met with workers in the oil sands industry and their families and other stakeholders and came up with a 3-point plan for addressing their needs in a transition away from fossil fuels, or a managed decline of reliance on fossil fuels, as we like to say. Number one, upskilling energy sector workers, so bridging the gap between skills they already have and the skills they need to create a renewable energy economy. Positioning existing energy sector stakeholders in this new economy we're trying to create. So if you caught my presentation earlier today, I was talking about supply chain parallels between our offshore oil and gas industry and potential offshore wind or tidal generation industries. And then integrating renewable energy technologies into non-renewable energy infrastructure. So this is taking industries like fossil fuel production and finding ways that we can use renewable energy, we can use cleaner technologies to really reduce the amount of carbon emission that goes into each barrel of oil produced, because as we've heard in the media, our government is still quite committed to increasing oil production in our province. They're aiming to double it. So if that's the case, I mean, we still need to try and push for a reduction in fossil fuel dependence and reliance, if for no other reason than to decouple our economy from such a volatile industry, but also to make sure that that process is being done and in as clean and environmentally friendly and as equitable a way as possible. So that is basically my angle on just transition. I'd like to get Kerry Murray to step to the podium to give his perspective, which is really from the perspective of labor, which has really been a driver in the transition, not transmission, movement, probably the primary driver. So Kerry, if you could come on up, please.
That's me. I thought this session was just transmission.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you. I guess first I'd like to, thank Delia and the committee for, inciting this discussion and conversation in our province. Very important. We're very dependent on fossil fuels, and we need to find the path to get to where we need to be. Secondly, I guess I'd like to acknowledge Seth. He's probably up 2 o'clock in the morning, our time. I feel in the spirit of fairness, I should have gotten up at 2 a.m. But I didn't. As Delia said, the labor movement has a huge role to play, as do other organizations and sectors in the economy. I'm going to speak from labor's perspective on just transition and what that means. First, a little bit about us, the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. We represent around 70,000 workers in every community in the province and every sector of the economy. We advocate on a whole range of issues: better labor laws, more progressive labor laws, occupational health and safety, that sort of thing, pay equity, gender equality, and issues around economic, social, and environmental justice. And we kind of do political bargaining. We don't do collective bargaining like our members are affiliated unions like NAPE or CUPE or PSAC. We deal a lot with government on a whole range of issues. I might whip through this, even though Andrew's not here. I bought his time from Delia. So the whole issue around just transition, it's extremely important to workers, especially those that work in industries that are impacted and affected. A plan is critical, and the assurance of a job for workers that are in those sectors of the economy where they're being phased out is hugely important. As a central labor body in the province, same as the Canadian Labour Congress, which is a central labor body, we're here to support our members and their families and the communities they live in the at the end of the day. And there's a balance to be had between finding good jobs, economic and social and environmental development, and the environment. So, and workers need to know, where are those jobs? If I'm working in, and I'll speak about the recent task force around the phase out of coal. Those workers need to know, where are those jobs and how do we get there? And, and what does that whole issue of just transition mean? Now, there are many different definitions of just transition. It's like the word sustainability, right? What does that mean? It means, there's many different perspectives on it. So, and the discussion is starting here on the ground floor. So a just transition for everyone, where you can bring, as been mentioned in the room today, it's equitable, it's fair, it leaves no one behind, or is it just a transition where you move? And we've seen examples of that. So as far as the labor movement is concerned, we've been engaged in this discussion for a while with our members, with our affiliates. We did a paper in 2009 around green jobs to just start that discussion. How do we, what's a green job? What's a green job in Newfoundland and Labrador? What's a green job for a worker? There's also the ILO, which is probably the UN, International Labour Organization, which is affiliated with the United Nations. And on the bottom, you'll see a just and fair transition, which is the phase out of coal and how that was addressed and the recommendations that flowed out of that process for government. So what is a just transition? So there are many definitions, as I said, so I tried to, it's an economy-wide process that produces plans, policies, and investments that lead to a future where all jobs are green and decent, emissions are at net zero, and communities are sustainable. It brings together workers, community, government, business in a framework of social dialogue. So we have a history of that in our province for probably a 10-year period where business, labor, government would discuss kind of big picture macroeconomic issues impacting the province and how you could work collectively to resolve some of them and move forward based on consensus, so to speak. So it includes measures to reduce the impact of job loss, produce, especially on workers and communities, produce new and good green jobs, as well as healthy, sustainable communities, and address all those issues collectively in, put them all on the one plate, and environmental, economic, and social, and environmental. So some of the key principles around just transition: obviously respect for workers, communities, families. They have to be at the center, and at every stage as you start discussing how you transition from fossil fuel industries to green industries. You can't have a very top-down approach. It has to be bottom-up and driven by those people that are impacted. Worker participation at every stage. Transitioning to good jobs, sustainable and healthy communities, planning for future. It has to look long-term. Has to be something that resonates nationally in this country, is driven regionally, but the solutions for the most part are local and place-based and allow people to participate, and immediate yet durable support. So there are all kinds of examples of just transition, and you can have this discussion in the province, and people would say about the fishery, but that really wasn't a just transition. That was more of a loss of a resource, but we probably didn't transition out of that industry very well. And even examples both nationally and internationally around just transition that probably didn't go as planned. There are many lessons to be learned there as well. So this task force around Canadian coal power workers and communities, unions, community, government, business representation around the table. That was the task force. It was co-chaired by Hassan Youssef, who's the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. Had a lot of meaningful and real engagement, which was critical. And it had a series of recommendations, and some I'll highlight. They went to every province, so it was Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. Alberta probably had the most workers and businesses that involved in coal mining, coal production, burning coal for energy. Saskatchewan was a Crown corporation. New Brunswick, it was New Brunswick Power. They had a generating station in Belledune. Nova Scotia, the coal industry there is like the fishery here. It's interwoven into communities, into people. It has a history that goes back to day one. So those were important considerations. So these are some of the recommendations that came out of that process of just transition. Embed the principles of transition into planning, legislation, regulatory, all those sorts of things. Develop, communicate, implement, monitor, evaluate, openness, transparency about the process from start to finish and beyond, including provisions for transition in federal environmental and labor legislation. Now bear in mind, the Canadian Labor Code only covers about 10%, less than 10% of all the workers in the country. It covers like airline industries, mining, banking, so there's a lot of industries that would not be covered, but there's a role there for the federal government, a leadership role, to kind of set the table as to how provinces then can follow some of their lead as to how you do that. And obviously, one of the most, equally important is you resource it. There's a lot of money that has to be put behind this, financial resources, but also human resources and other things to make sure that it's successful. So for workers, you want locally available supports. You want to, for some workers, provide a pathway to retirement. If you have a worker, let's just say the oil industry collapsed in Newfoundland and Labrador, workers that are out there that are near retirement are probably not going to want, nor should they have to retrain. So there's a way to do that, to phase them out, and transition workers into sustainable employment. So take, for example, here, I don't want to say anything bad. So one of my coworkers is here who will certainly tell me if I do, may even tell my boss. But take a company like Equinor, which has a huge footprint in the oil and gas industry here in Newfoundland and Labrador. They are drilling one of the deepest deep water wells on the planet, 500 miles offshore. But they're also one of the biggest investors in Europe and in North America in wind power. They have a large wind project, I think, off the coast of Scotland, floating wind. I mean, it's not anchored to the ground. They also have a huge wind project that's being built, or is probably already built, off the Atlantic seaboard, off the coast of New York. Same skills that oil and gas workers would use. It's engineering, it's welding, it's mechanical, it's, all that kind of stuff. So don't think that companies in the fossil fuel sector don't understand where we're going here as a planet and what's going to happen down the road. They're getting ready for it. Probably just not as much here. So I was just going to go back. So one other thing that's in the country that some people here would be interested in maybe is that the Federation of Labour is also part of a SSHRC Social Sciences Humanity Research Council of Canada project out of York University dealing with adapting climate workers and workplaces to climate change. So one of the things they're looking at is just transition globally and nationally and even regionally in Canada and beyond. Looking at compiling a lot of best practices. I put the website there. They have a repository of research, community-based research and academic research that's extremely valuable. And it has a huge labor focus. Around the table, which is probably 40 organizations represented, There are many unions there. To give you an example of some of the work that's come out of that is with Canada Post. And in PEI, they're piloting a project where they're putting charging stations for electrical vehicles at rural post offices. I mean, they're in it's the most common building in rural Canada is the post office. So it's brilliant. It's right in front of you. But I thought it was, a really good project. So if you look at just transition in Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm not going to say I'm glad that we're having that conversation. And as an organization, it's very important to the Federation of Labor. As I said, we represent a lot of workers in industries that are going to be impacted. And we have to have that discussion with our members first. And that's a very difficult discussion sometimes if you're looking at workers, let's say, at the Come By Chance oil refinery, or if you're looking at people working offshore or onshore, but working in oil and gas. So it's an industry, it's a discussion that is you have to make sure you understand how to have it. But we have an overdependence on fossil fuels. I don't think I'm going overboard by saying that here in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's 20% of our GDP. When oil goes up and the value of the American dollar changes, it gets even way higher. And sometimes when oil was $100 a barrel, it was, and it's never going there again. And it's roughly 3% of employment. And our province wants to double production by 2030, which I'm not going to say my opinion on that, but I'll just point to that graphic where investing $1 million in clean energy and clean technology produces significant more employment than investing the same amount of money in fossil fuels. So I'll just leave that. So how do we get there? Like, how do we go down this road of just transition? I think, first of all, you have to be very proactive. You don't want to be reactive. We don't want to be in a position where an industry or a company is forced to shut down because of a phase out or a lack of demand for their product. And then we have to, oh, wow, we have to transition now. You're behind the 8 ball. So we need to have the foundation in place before it happens. And there are many examples of how you can do that and get it right or get most of it right. We have a history of social dialogue here in Newfoundland and Labrador. The Federation of Labor was involved with the provincial government and a number of business organizations where we sat down regularly and talked about some really difficult issues. The ones that we didn't think we could agree on, we didn't talk about them because what's the point? Where there's no common ground. But where you think you can get consensus, you can do it. You need progressive, collaboratively built public policy. And the benefits are significant around just transition if it's done properly and in advance, and you have the right people around the table, and you engage people every step of the way. The benefits are significant around employment, community sustainability, and those sorts of things. But the opportunity costs of not doing it are huge and immeasurable. So I think that's kind of, so I'll just end there. And I guess you're up next. Or Seth, I mean.
Thank you very much, Kerry. It's really great to hear from the Newfoundland and Labrador labor perspective regarding this transition, how we're responding to climate change. Okay, next I'm going to hand it over to Seth Klein. As I mentioned, he was the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's been involved in just transition in a number of ways. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but we're very, very fortunate to have him joining us on this panel. So just let me, I think this is going to work. No. Hi. Volume sounds great. I'm trying to make this full screen. I'm not very tech savvy. British Columbia, sorry. I do have that on my paper. All right, now the edge. I'm just gonna get our tech support in here. Okay. Yeah, because right now you're just a little window on a big screen. I told them not to leave me in charge of this. They coming? Oh dear. Okay. Oh, that did something. But now we can see us as well. You know what? I think that'll work until we get some intervention. Okay, so Seth, you can see all of us, yes? Okay. No, now you are about half the screen. So that is an improvement. Thank you so much, Seth. That was very interesting. And I love that parallel between the warlike effort of the war, World War II, and what we're facing right now, because that's really, not to be dramatic, but what is required in order to make the changes that need to be made to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So right now, Kerry, I'm going to invite you up to the couch. Sorry to put you on the stand there. I'll join you on the other couch, but we're going to do a Q&A period. Um, we'll have, between 10 and 15 minutes, probably up to 15 minutes to do the Q&A. Everything's about 10 minutes behind schedule, so I apologize for that, but that's how it goes. So as we mentioned this morning, before we did the Q&A, I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to kind of collect your thoughts and come up with some good questions, peer review your questions. To second what Brett said, questions end in a question mark. There will be time for comments in the Citizens Assembly discussion period. So I'll start the timer now. It's 11:58. We'll start the questions at 12, and I'll come around with a microphone and we'll get some real good discussion going. Nope. All right. Thank you. I am useless. There we go. So put him down there. Okay, great. And so if I want to get him full screen again. Okay. Good. All right. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna ask my
I'm thinking that should work too. For this, at least. I don't know, we'll see. Try it out. Try it out. Exactly. Oh, here it goes.
Okay, can everyone hear me? So I'm just going to kind of wander around. Let's get started now with the Q&A session. Okay, Seth, you're back up on the big screen. Okay. To answer questions, you will. All right. Does anybody have any questions for either of our panelists or myself here this afternoon or this morning? Sure. Hold on. I'll pass you the mic so that Seth can hear you.
Hi, Glenn Sharp. For Seth, so one of the questions that I have for you is in your relation to war driving a change. Two items come out of that. One, there's a very clear fear of what happens if you don't go to war and fight the change. And there's a very clear plan of what to do to actually go to war, and we're going to go over there and fight these guys. We're in a situation that not all of the individuals or people of our, even though we see that times are changing, not everybody's fearing what happens if we do nothing. And then the more prevalent problem is we don't all know what to do. There isn't a big consensus of this is the action, and there isn't the same driving force of everybody being told this is what we collectively do. Or is there? So I'm throwing it out for your comments on those two items.
To it as the voice of doom. And every night there was a map showing progress of the war. And so I actually think when it comes to climate change and extreme weather events, we are actually starting to see attacks on our soil. And we should have a map showing that every night on the news. And we should all be saying to the CBC, look, if you can have sports every hour of every morning, And if you can have a business report every hour of every morning, which is mostly meaningless symbology to most people, we damn well can have a climate emergency report once every morning, so that we start to build this sense that this is real. You say, though, in your question, you talked about planning, and I would just point this out. We didn't have a plan at the outset of the war. It took some time to ramp it up. The U.S. had an advantage, which is that because they joined 2 years later, they actually had 2 years where Roosevelt was engaged in deep planning with a whole team of economists, planning the transition of the economy, so that when, after Pearl Harbor, at the end of 41, when the U.S. did declare war, the scope of the transition in the U.S. was mind-boggling. They declared war in December 41, and 2 months later in February, the last private automobile rolled off the assembly line. But in Canada, we didn't have that luxury, and it took a little longer. But it happened. And that's why I say we're in the phony war period now. We're ramping up. We're not yet there.
It's really interesting. I did notice that the CBC has kind of started covering climate change a lot more, and they have kind of regular reporting on that now. I'm just going to go to the back. I think she had her hand up first.
Hi, thank you. My name is Alana. I don't know if this question is directed towards any of you specifically. I think all of you could have your own responses to it, your own perspectives, and Seth especially maybe because it's a little bit outside. He could have a fresh perspective because the rest of us are really caught up in what's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador right now. And I'll get to that. So we've been hearing all morning, all day so far about the oil and gas industry and how prevalent that is in our economy. And I mean, that's hugely important. We're going to be doubling that by 2030. We're on the track for that, at least anyway. But what hasn't been mentioned is Muskrat Falls. And the irony here, of course, is that it's been sold to us as a green technology. And Seth, I don't know how much you know about Muskrat Falls right now. There's a massive inquiry going on, and it gets worse and worse and worse as it goes on. But we, as like how Bill phrased it, we face a massive debt bomb. We are already facing it, and it's about to get worse. So my question is, in keeping Muskrat Falls in mind, how does that change what is required for Newfoundland and Labrador to make this just transition?
All right, maybe Kerry, you can take a stab at that one, and then Seth, if you've got anything you'd like to add.
Okay. I knew Muskrat Falls would come up. But for us as, I mean, the premise, I guess, around how that's rolled out and unfolded is, and the impacts that it's going to have going forward, it's hard to say. Around just transition, I mean, if you drive across the province or anyone who hikes, you can see the amount of transmission lines that have been built in this province and the amount of, I guess, natural forestry that's been removed because of it. So I'm not really in a position to comment on how Muskrat, I don't even know, and I pay attention to the inquiry and that sort of thing. The only good thing I can see about it is that river will never run dry. I don't know if that's of any consolation to, I mean, we live on an island in the North Atlantic with a huge coastline along Labrador. The impacts of climate change and the things we do as a province are huge when it comes to some of those issues. So I mean, I can't really comment on where I think that's going to happen.
I'll just make the comment here myself that I think Muskrat Falls was a really good example of a good idea that was not properly executed. The project itself could serve to generate a lot of prosperity for Newfoundland and Labrador, but the appropriate people weren't necessarily consulted, our Indigenous groups weren't adequately involved, the long-term consequences weren't fully considered. and the process whereby the project was sanctioned was not transparent. So I think to look at it from a positive perspective, you could take the lessons learned and apply that to what needs to happen now and what could be done in our province to build some more economic prosperity in the face of this massive debt that we're facing. As Seth mentioned, we don't really have much choice when it comes to climate change, even if we are not in a great financial position. The money will be found somewhere in, a more large-scale federal or global response. Seth, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
Yeah, I do. So I have been following Muskrat Falls, and some British Columbians are as a cautionary tale, because we're following you down this rabbit hole, as some of you may be aware, with our own Site C Dam, which is minimally a $10 billion new dam being built in BC's north. The additional insult and irony in the case of the Site C Dam is that really the only need for that electricity is to electrify the fracking fields and the desire to have a liquefied natural gas industry. So it's a green energy to provide electricity to a new and emerging fossil fuel industry. And so many of us are deeply engaged in both of those fights, and at the CCPA-BC office, a lot of our climate work is focused on fracking and LNG. Now, the advantage in BC's case with a larger population base is that what will be a massive expenditure, the cost of that will get spread over more ratepayers, but it is going to have a huge impact. It's not going to have as huge an impact in terms of the debt burden and cost to ratepayers as Muskrat Falls relative to each of you. But I do think in both cases, it raises the issue of, all energy, as we make this transition, all energy costs are going to go up. And we need the cost of that to be shared in a progressive way. And so we need to be thinking about income transfers to low and modest income households. We need to be bringing an energy poverty lens to this. We all need to be thinking about how we restructure rates of our hydro systems, whether it's BC Hydro or in Newfoundland. There are creative ways of structuring the rate structure that bring an energy poverty lens to it, rather than just having a postage stamp rate that applies the same to everybody, regardless of their household income. So that's what I mean when I say we need to look at the connections between climate action and inequality. Is how do we do what we need to do on climate in a non-regressive manner, and we need to raise a bunch of new money, as I said, to offset some of these debts. The one I think light in around the cloud in the case of Newfoundland with Muskrat Falls is at least you will have an energy source that is electric as we electrify our whole economy.
One more comment around one of the many probably bad outcomes of Muskrat Falls. And I think someone alluded to it earlier this morning that the actual production and getting it into the grid or the market of alternative energy is not allowed here. So because we're essentially all things Muskrat Falls, which they put out as green energy, it stymies innovation in the development of other alternative energy sources. And that stymies innovation as itself in an economy where if we were transitioning workers in a just way into another sector, energy, fossil fuel energy into green energy or alternative energy, that's an avenue that's probably closed to us because we don't have as much wind energy, solar energy. We're an island. I mean, tidal energy. There's so many sources of alternative energy being used successfully in not only in other national jurisdictions, but internationally, that we don't have. I don't understand it, why we don't, but that's part of the reason. So the point that Muskrat Falls, not only the debt and how poorly managed it was, and was probably initially a good idea, and at some point, it stymies the whole process of innovation in alternative energy, which in the long term will hurt us.
We're running very low on time, so unfortunately, I'm just going to take one more question. I'm going to ask everyone to make it quick question, quick responses, and then we'll move into the Citizens Assembly component. So I believe Stephen here had his hand up first. Well, we can address the questions everybody else has in the actual Citizens Assembly.
Cool. Yep, my name is Stephen. And I'm just wondering how important it is to have clarity on the fact that we cannot assume that we're going to double offshore oil and gas production by 2030, and having clarity on something like a moratorium or something like provincial government clarity that this industry is going to shift. I'm seeing in my own province in Nova Scotia conversations around the just transition for workers in the coal sector not happening the way that they should be, because our government is sort of pretending like it's not going to happen and we're going to burn coal till 2040. So I am wondering how important that is to make this conversation on just transition a bit more immediate and real.
I can start. I think part of it for us, especially in the labor movement, is that we recognize that there's a leadership role for labor in this conversation. And to get the workers, government especially, and the business side and community at the table. I mean, you have to. There are difficult discussions, for those groups to have, but they're even more difficult for the individual worker and their family and the community. So there's a leadership role here for labor. We see that. There's a leadership role for government and that sort of thing. I think for Newfoundland and Labrador, getting our politicians to openly have that discussion and acknowledge that, maybe the golden age of fossil fuel may be past or passing us by. That's a hard realization, no different than it was a hard realization in Alberta, and it still is. Now they've got someone there that is never going to probably acknowledge that. And as it was for workers in the coal sector in our country, in Alberta, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. And the unions representing those workers played a significant role in educating and creating a level of knowledge and awareness with those workers and the communities they lived in, that this can happen in a just and equitable and fair way. But it's a difficult discussion to not only start but to have. But it has to happen.
Seth, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the short answer to your question is it's super important to have that acknowledged. When we're addicted to something, the first step is to admit it, and then to say we need to switch direction. And as I said before, it's not about turning off the taps overnight, but it is being clear with people about the U-turn that we now have to make and the new direction we have to be on. And maybe I can just conclude at this point about leadership. This is why leadership matters. That's why it's so important that you've got leaders like Kerry or Gil in Alberta, labor leaders who are having a truthful conversation with their members about the inevitability of the transitions that are happening and what's actually happening in the international fossil fuel marketplace. I've interviewed a ton of politicians and political insiders for my book, and one of the frustrating things is that when you're talking with almost all of them, in one way or another, they come back to some version of the line that says, you have to meet people where they're at. But what strikes me about the leaders we remember from World War II is that they didn't actually meet people where they were at. They took people where they needed to go. And that kind of leadership is about telling people the truth. And that's that's what we need to do.
Excellent points. Guys, I know we could continue this discussion well into the day, and I would have loved to have done that as well. But we're going to have to move on to our Citizens Assembly component here now. So Seth, thank you so much for joining us. You can stay tuned to have a listen in our discussions, or you can get back to bed or to your family. Up to you. I'm just going to review what is actually going to be. Okay, well, thank you very much. And that was a great discussion. So everybody, maybe another round of applause for Seth.